All right, welcome back. I'm here with Andrew Pitts from Sydney, Australia, founder and CEO of Polinode. Andrew, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks, Sam.
Hey, I'm really excited to talk with you again. I've been tracking how you've been doing. Obviously, organizational network analysis has been catching, I was about to say catching fire, as given that you're based in Australia and me in California, we shouldn't be talking about fire. So let's just say it's getting ever more popular, and rightly so, because it's measuring the interactions and the nature of those interactions. So I know you're going to take it from here, and we'll you present for 20 minutes or so, then we'll have a quick chat. So if you would introduce yourself and get on with it, and I'll come back in a little bit. Sound good?
Great. Yeah, sounds great. So yeah, as Al said, founder and CEO of Polinode, and let me just share my screen now. And so what I want to present on is really the intersection of organizational network analysis and diversity and inclusion. And so I have just a few slides by way of introduction and setting the context, a bit of background. But where I really want to focus and spend the most time on here is talking about how we can get actionable insights. And I have some real hands-on examples, 8 hands-on examples in terms of actionable D&I insights from O&A data. So just by way of introduction to Polinode, as Al said, it's all about organizational network analysis. So Polinode is a platform for O&A, and it allows you to visualize and analyze the informal networks between people. So to find the informal communities, different measures of centrality, collaboration, and so on. And there's really 2 types of organizational network analysis. There's what's called active organizational network analysis, which is where we run relationship-based surveys. So we ask people questions like, who do you go to for advice? Who do you work with often? Those types of questions. And then there's also passive organizational network analysis, which is where we plug into the digital exhaust of organizations. So we have integrations with, for example, Office 365, so email data, calendar data. We also have integrations with Slack, with Teams, with Google, and so on. And so, Polinode is a platform for both active and passive organizational network analysis data. And so bringing this to diversity and inclusion, why are we talking about diversity and inclusion in the context of O&A? Well, for me, it's really about moving beyond, questions around representation. So are we 50% male, 50% female, for example, and thinking about questions of inclusion, really, and acknowledging the role that networks plays in that. So if you look at this, very simple network diagram on the right-hand side. So think of the green nodes as, or the green circles as being males, and the yellow ones being females, and the triangle there being somebody that's relatively senior in the organization. So all of the connections to that more senior person who happens to be a male are also to males. So this is just a simple example to demonstrate, the relationship between diversity and inclusion and networks. And one of the points that I want to make here is that networks tend to have persistence, right? So when you think about the power dynamics within organizations, networks are part of the problem because they help ensure the persistence of those power dynamics, right? And so, I'm a huge fan of networks, and I believe that, they can give us a lot of really valuable insight. But I also think for that reason, they can be part of the problem too. And I just also want to take a step back and just think about the broader social context here. So this diagram here basically looks at if you've got 5 quintiles of income in the US, quintile 1, quintile 2, and you have people that are born as children and they're either black or white, what quintile of income do they end up as in adults, right? And this is a story about persistence as well, right? So if we look at white at the top and black down the bottom, one of the key points from this is that white children in the highest income quintile are 21% more likely than at random to end up in the highest income quartile as adults. So there's a glass ceiling. And if we look at black children, down the bottom, those Black children that are born into the highest income quintile are actually less likely to end up in the wealthiest quintile than at random. And so this is a story about persistence as well. And networks are a part of this. And of course, this is about the social context and about economic mobility. And organizations have a really important role in to play in this as well, right? So there are broader social questions, of course, but we must all acknowledge the role that organizations play. And so here, there's a relatively simple diagram that I've just drawn up here to illustrate that an organization with 4 levels, other being the lowest, top being the highest, and this organization has lateral hires coming in. It also has an entry intake, so graduates, for example. And as people come in either laterally or through an entry intake, there's a question of promotion, so moving up the different levels. And there's also a question of attrition. So this I just wanted to use as a bit of a framework to introduce or talk about some of the important diversity and inclusion questions, and particularly highlight how some of those are related to networks. So the first question here is, are we attracting diverse talent to the top of our funnel? How do we market? Who do we market to? Do we rely too much on the networks of our existing talent? So that's a network question at the top of the funnel. Question 2, how do we ensure an equitable hiring and decision-making process? And that's for lateral hires in particular. Are they coming in at the right level and with an appropriate, and by appropriate I mean equitable, benefits and compensation package? Question 3, how are we onboarding our diverse talent? And I think that's a really important network question as well. Are we effectively integrating them into the network? How much time is that taking? And is the integration of our diverse talent different to the integration of the rest of the talent? And so yes, it's a learning and development question, but it's also a really important networks question. And the fourth question, what opportunities are we giving our diverse talent? How are we ensuring that they have advocates, champions, mentors? And that's about connection, in particular connection to people that are more senior than yourself. So that's also a key network question. And attrition, to what degree does our diverse talent leave for different reasons, earlier or later on average? And so attrition can also be viewed as a network question because it's also related to personal networks. And there is an impact in terms of if somebody that I'm connected to leaves, then that has an impact on the probability of me leaving as well. So with that, in terms of frameworks and introductions, time to get hands-on with some examples. So like I said, I have 8 examples that I want to get through here. So, talking about data, talking about O&A and diversity and inclusion. So the first one is looking at active nominations. So in an active O&A, we often ask a question, like a general name generator question at the beginning, like, please identify up to 20 people or company who are important to your ability to accomplish your work priorities. And then we analyze that data in a whole bunch of different ways. So we look at communities, we look at bridges and brokers and boundary spanners and collaboration, different measures of centrality. But one way that we look at that data is we also like to use regression. So we regress the total number of nominations on some explanatory variables, which usually include seniority and tenure. And we'll often include gender and, where available, ethnicity in that. So here I've just included some illustrative regression results to give you a sense for this type of analysis. And you can see there's a positive relationship with tenure. You can see there's a positive relationship with seniority. So somebody at the highest level of the organization compared to somebody at the lowest level of the organization, we expect them to receive roughly 29 more nominations on average. And here, if we look at female, what the interpretation of this is that females on average compared to males controlling for tenure and controlling for level receive roughly 2 less nominations on average. And this is fairly typical in terms of the data that we see. So generally between -1.5, -2.5 is fairly typical. It ranges, it varies between different organizations. And you can also, of course, look at how that changes over time, and also does this vary in different parts of our organization, different divisions, locations, and so on? Second example I want to look at is mentorship. So we'll often ask a question, please identify up to 5 people who provide you with career-related advice and assistance. And this diagram on the right-hand side, the T -1, T -2, and other show the levels. And we're breaking the number of mentors that people nominate through those different levels, and by BIPOC versus non-BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color versus the rest of the population, looking at the number of mentors that people have by those different levels. And this relates back to that that simplified network diagram that I was looking at right at the start, which is where what we often find, and particularly for people that come in laterally, is that the more junior levels, the more diverse populations will be less connected to people that are more senior, and in particular, less connected in terms of mentorship to people that are more senior than themselves. So now, how can we kind of drive actual change and insight from this? And one of the ways that we do that is via individual network reports. And here is an extract from an individual network report. And so, related to what I was talking about in terms of diverse populations, what people have done in the past and what we've helped people with is to, run workshops around with a diverse population. And part of that is to, show them what their network looks like, and also to drill in to look at their connections by seniority, which is what we've highlighted here. What people have done less of, and what I expect people to start doing more of, is also to show that more senior population what their network looks like, especially the mentorship connections, formal and informal, in terms of different diverse characteristics as well. Onboarding, in terms of the framework at the start, I mentioned how important onboarding was in the context of diversity and inclusion. And here's an example of how we can use passive organizational network analysis in the context of onboarding. So the horizontal axis here shows tenure, and the vertical axis is the number of connections. So as we go further to the right, people have been with the organization longer, and as we go higher up vertically, they have a greater degree of connection or integration within the overall network. And so this group towards the bottom left have a relatively low tenure and a relatively low degree of connection to the rest of the organization. And so this helps us ask questions around, how effectively are we integrating our diverse talent? Is there a difference between the BIPOC population and the non-BIPOC population, between males and females? Is it different in different parts of our organization? And also, where appropriate, one can also look at individual level data as well, and try and address any issues before they become before they blow up or become big issues. And so reducing the likelihood of attrition, particularly attrition of the diverse population, through a lack of integration. Example number 5. So here I want to talk a little bit about overload. It's important to acknowledge that overload is experienced differently by different groups. And so I just want to give a few kind of gentle reminders here about some populations here. So in the US, solo parents are more likely to be female and Black compared to cohabiting parents. So 81% of solo parents are mothers and 19% are fathers. So thinking about gender. And solo mothers are more than twice as likely to be Black relative to the population as a whole. Also thinking about caregivers. So 34.2 million Americans have provided unpaid care to an adult aged 50 or older in the last 12 months. And 75% of caregivers are female. 57% of Black caregivers provide high burden care, and that compares to 33% of white caregivers. And 66% of Black caregivers are employed full or part-time. So, obviously we're talking about the future of work here, so it's important to acknowledge that, there's a a lot of caregivers that are, either in full-time or part-time employment. And the other population I just want to acknowledge here as well is the neurodiverse population. So thinking in particular about, for example, the dyslexic population, as well as, the autistic population. So why am I talking about this? Why am I giving these examples? Just to say here that some groups do not have as much, call it what you want, capacity, slack, or ability to respond to work surges as other groups. Well, they might not have as much for various reasons. And this is related to the D&I question. And the analysis of work patterns data has a lot to give here. So for example, questions like, are we placing a higher load on some groups than other groups? Or is there evidence that they are responding to that load differently? So there's some really interesting work happening with natural language processing that looks at the content of communication. And we don't touch content, so it's not something that we're doing. But it specifically looks for signs of stress and potential mental health issues, right? And of course, there's a lot of important questions about privacy and protecting people there. But I also think that there is a lot of good that can be done with that data in the context of diversity and inclusion, right? So looking at how different groups are potentially responding to what might be different loads or the same loads in different ways. And then, are there diverse groups that are more likely to leave the organization in response to higher workloads? So that's a question that I think has a lot of potential, and I don't think there are many people that are really looking at that question, in too much detail in terms of work patterns analysis yet. And why do I talk about work patterns analysis? When I'm also talking about organizational network analysis, because they're really strongly related. So we've seen a lot of demand and interest in using the passive data that we initially collect for organizational network analysis for the analysis of work patterns data. So as a result of that, we've made it possible to export message by message data, optionally anonymized, and that includes in local time zones for the individual's time of day and day of week. So you can look at, are people working after hours, weekends, etc., using the same data that we, generate for networks and network analysis. So talking a little bit about homophily here. So here we're looking at gender, and you can see this diagram on the left-hand side. There's a big difference in terms of how the genders present themselves, female and male, in location 1 versus location 5. So it's helpful to look at that visually, but also the way that we often look at that is a collaboration matrix. So the way that we read this is that the row headings are the froms and the column headings are the tos. So 39.2% of females kind of nominate or are connected to, of the connections that come from females, 39.2 go to other females, and that compares to a relative size of 30.4%. And so the ratio of 39.2 to 30.4 is 1.3 times. So females are connected to females 1.3 times more than what we would expect on average. So we often look at that in terms of a collaboration matrix. Just a note here is to be aware that divisions and teams, and HR is a classic example, they tend to have they might have a gender skew, and sometimes there's a race ethnicity skew as well, but that's less common. So we often kind of need to account for that too. Network data can help prevent people from flying under the radar. So here, what does this table look at? Well, if we look at the predicted value and the actual value, we're looking at nominations, so active nominations. And so if we account for seniority as well as tenure, Caleb has a predicted value in terms of number of nominations of 26 versus the actual number of nominations received of 77, which is a delta of 51. And so here we're sorting by that residual or delta, and we are coloring here to show the less senior groups, so other and T-2 are highlighted. And this allows us to ask some really interesting questions in the context of ethnicity and gender as well. So, for example, is the delta or surprise factor on average larger for Black or Asian or Hispanic populations, males, females, so on? And is this different in different parts of our organization as well? And the last example, so the last slide here, is how we can combine both active and passive data together to give us diversity and inclusion kind of insights, particularly in the context of unconscious bias. So the horizontal axis here looks at the percentile rank of passive nominations. So where does somebody sit in terms of the number of nominations, the number of connections they have for passive data, so think email data. And the vertical axis is the same thing, but for active nominations. So if someone is below the 45-degree line, they're higher on passive, which is objective, than they are on active, which is subjective. And so we can see that there is, in this diagram, more females below that line than there are males on average, right? And so we can also ask that question, is this different at different levels in our organization in different parts? But basically what they're saying is that females on average tend to be higher in terms of that objective measure than they are when we ask people for their nominations. And that's a really interesting insight into unconscious bias as well. Thank you.
Here I come. Sorry for the delay, Andrew. Hey, as you were going through that, I got really happy. And this is why, because O&A, as you well know, used to be paper-based. It used to be a survey that you'd ask and who you do connect with at what frequency. It'd be the nature of that communication. And here we are in a very more dynamic, thus insightful time. And every time I talk with you and see what you have to share, it gets deeper and more meaningful and thus more actionable. One of the things that I want to pick up on, because we don't have much time, obviously, is this notion of capacity. We talked about it in the previous session. I have long talked about it as an opportunity that we have yet to really realize in analytics and HR and leadership in general, where what's going on for people? What can they actually handle? Because if we get a understanding of that at scale, we can then do workforce planning, not only from a skill-based capability perspective, but from a capacity perspective. How many of them do we need? How much are they going to be working? What is their productivity or output over time going to be? So can you, of the 8, can you focus on that 1 second and just share where you think it's going to go? Is that going to be kind of a major hook for your customers and prospects moving forward, or is it something else that I might be missing?
Yeah, so I think the capacity one is really interesting, right? I just think there's so much potential there, and I think we're really just getting started in terms of being able to tap into those different data sources, right? And obviously, we are starting to focus on, the potential for email data, right, and calendar data and Slack data, and what that says about the load that people are taking, right? But I also think there's so much ability to combine it with other data sets, right? So that's what I'm really kind of was trying to say there with the diversity and inclusion data, is I don't think people are really thinking too much yet about how can we look at that load data with our ethnicity data, right? And with our attrition data as well. So yeah, maybe a little bit with the attrition data, but there's so much when we start to combine those different data sets, we can look at all kinds of different questions. And then that's part of organizational network analysis. But then when we can ask people questions as part of an active O&A about access to other people, also about knowledge and these types of questions as well, and combine that kind of active data as well with the work patterns data too, then we can do so many different things with that. And yeah, I think we're like 5% of the way there, to be honest.
I mean, we're, I don't know, 8,000 miles apart. Right? I could hug you for saying that. I really could, because I I've long said we're like at a 2 on a 10-point scale of where we're going to be in 5, 10, plus years on this specific topic. So I certainly celebrate that you're nudging us down that progression. I will say this too, because there's a lot to explore. We're due to do a podcast, so we'll slow down a little bit and get some more time and go deeper on these topics, because I want to applaud you and your team for what you've created, the visualizations, the insights. I mean, it's all fantastic stuff. So it's not a surprise that you're doing well. So keep it up.
Thanks, Al. Yeah, appreciate it.
Well, you be well, and look forward to talking soon.
Cool. Thank you.